The air over Britain in the early months of 1940 felt heavy with the tension of a nation standing at the edge of an abyss, a country unsure of whom to trust or what future awaited it as Europe fell, one desperate piece at a time, to the relentless machinery of fascism. In this uncertain landscape stood a man who was never meant to be the face of defiance, a quiet strategist often dismissed as too rigid, too cold, too methodical for the fiery political theatre unfolding in London. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, with his thin frame and introspective gaze, appeared more scholar than warrior, a commander who measured words as carefully as he measured losses, and who understood, long before others, that wars of the sky were not won by charisma but by preparation, calm, and precision. He was a man who lacked political allies, who did not attend the right dinners or flatter the right ministers, and who refused to sacrifice the lives of young pilots to score points in the smoky chambers of Westminster. Yet he carried on his shoulders the fragile hope of a nation whose survival unknowingly depended on him. At the same time, Winston Churchill surged into power on a wave of rhetoric and force, a man forged by conflict and contradiction, brilliant and flawed in equal measure, driven by a belief that Britain must never surrender even when the world seemed determined to fold in upon itself. Though Churchill would later be celebrated as the lion who roared in Britain's darkest hour, he could not yet grasp the full magnitude of what Dowding was quietly constructing far from the political spotlights, an intricate system of detection, coordination, and disciplined response that would shape the very outcome of the war. It was not that Churchill dismissed the air war entirely. He understood its importance, perhaps instinctively, but he never expected that a man so devoid of political influence could build an aerial shield capable of withstanding the most formidable air force the world had ever seen. Dowding worked in silence, shaping Britain's air defence into something revolutionary, something that would not simply resist Luftwaffe assaults, but anticipate them. He oversaw the development of radar into a functional web of early warning stations that stretched across the coast like a second, invisible wall. He coordinated ground observers, communication centres, and fighter command in a way no nation had attempted before. And even as politicians argued, hesitated, and reshuffled priorities, Dowding persisted, understanding that every delay meant another squadron unprepared, another station understaffed, another young pilot sent into battle without support. He battled bureaucrats who considered radar a novelty, officers who demanded aggressive offensives instead of measured defence, and ministers who sought bold gestures over strategic patience. Yet in his calm defiance, he forged something extraordinary. When Churchill looked at Dowding in those early days, he saw a capable officer perhaps, a steady hand, someone useful, but not indispensable. What he did not expect was that this unassuming man, operating with minimal political backing and facing near constant opposition from within the Air Ministry, would knit together the complex machinery that would prevent Britain from collapsing under the storm that was coming. Dowding saw the danger long before the politicians did. He knew that the Luftwaffe would come in force, that the might of continental air power would test Britain's resolve not just in battles, but in the endurance of its systems, its supply chains, its training programs, its nerves. And still, he was left to navigate the storm without the support he deserved. Dismissed by many as overly cautious, even defeatist, because he refused to waste lives in reckless offensives that served no strategic purpose. But Dowding's strength lay in foresight and restraint, qualities that rarely earn applause in times of fear and desperation. He prepared Britain for a battle Churchill had not yet imagined in full, a battle that would unfold not in the fields of France or the trenches of Flanders, but in the skies above ordinary towns, over farms and cities and coastlines where civilians would look up and see history written in contrails and fire. And though Churchill would later recognise the brilliance of Dowding's work, at this moment, in the uncertain dawn of 1940, he did not expect that this quiet commander would accomplish feats that defied the odds, challenge the Luftwaffe's supremacy, and preserve the fragile heartbeat of a nation standing alone. If you are watching this now, let me know in the comments. Where in the world you are joining us from the months that followed the fall of France were a slow tightening of a noose, that seemed to draw ever closer around Britain's throat. And in those narrowing days, Hugh Dowding worked with an urgency that never spilled into panic, an intensity that remained hidden beneath a quiet exterior. He walked the operations rooms with the silent vigilance of a man who understood that every misplaced wire, every delayed message, every misinterpreted radar echo could mean the loss of airfields, factories, and human lives. Below the dim glow of filtered lights, squadrons were moved like living pieces across vast maps, as Dowding refined the delicate choreography between radar stations, observers, controllers, and pilots. He ensured that fighter aircraft were scrambled only at the most critical moments, preserving precious machines and irreplaceable lives. Where politicians saw hesitation, he saw necessity. Where others demanded action for its own sake, he demanded precision. In London, Churchill watched the storm growing, sensing the ferocity with which Hitler intended to break Britain's spirit. Yet he still underestimated the scale of Dowding's creation, for the Prime Minister's attention was consumed by crises on every front. Naval losses, the threat of invasion, pressure from Allied governments in exile, and the morale of a population now living under the shadow of nightly air raid sirens. Dowding rarely spoke loudly enough to command the Prime Minister's attention, and when he did, his tone lacked the fire that Churchill instinctively admired. But beneath the quiet, Dowding's work had taken on a life of its own, forming an architecture of defence so advanced that it would later be studied for decades. The first waves of Luftwaffe aggression were probing strikes, testing Britain's resolve, and Churchill believed his commanders would respond boldly and visibly. Yet Dowding refused to play the game the enemy expected. He denied requests to send large fighter escorts to France in the final days of its collapse, a choice that earned him political enemies but preserved the core of fighter command. It was a decision Churchill had not anticipated, one that seemed at first almost unpatriotic, but that would later prove essential in ensuring that Britain had the pilots and aircraft needed for the battle ahead. Dowding's refusal to squander resources was not an act of weakness, but a calculation rooted in cold logic. Britain could not afford another disaster. As the tempo of German assaults increased, Dowding fought another, quieter battle behind closed doors, a struggle against those within the Air Ministry who sought to reshape fighter strategy into a more aggressive, offensive-minded doctrine. They claimed that meeting the enemy far from British shores would demonstrate strength and relieve pressure on home defences. But Dowding saw only the mathematics of loss. He knew that every mile flown toward the enemy was a mile farther from home, from fuel, from the lines of communication that formed the skeleton of Britain's aerial survival. He stood his ground, earning resentment, but holding fast to a vision few others could see. Churchill, meanwhile, found himself drawn increasingly into the political tempest brewing around air strategy. Advisors urged him to replace Dowding with someone more charismatic, someone capable of stirring enthusiasm among pilots and ministers alike. Churchill listened, but he also sensed something beneath the surface. Beneath Dowding's reserve lay a stability Britain desperately needed. Though he did not fully grasp the intricacies of the defence system Dowding commanded, he understood instinctively that the man before him possessed an unwavering determination that mirrored his own. Still, Churchill never expected Dowding to withstand the political pressure bearing down upon him. He never imagined that this quiet figure could stand so firmly against both the enemy in the skies and the adversaries within his own command. By the time the Luftwaffe began its major assaults, Britain's aerial shield stood ready, not because of sweeping political support, but in spite of its absence. Dowding had shaped a force that could respond with speed and discipline, a force that could absorb casualties yet remain functional, a force whose true strength lay not just in its pilots, but in the invisible network that guided them. Churchill, watching the first great battles unfold from underground war rooms, realized that Dowding had built something remarkable, something the politicians had not fully understood or appreciated. The quiet man had exceeded every expectation, not through grand gestures, but through unyielding clarity of purpose. If you are finding this story compelling so far, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next chapter as we continue. The summer of 1940 arrived with a strange, suspended stillness, as if the entire island were holding its breath while waiting for the inevitable storm to break upon its shores. Fields ripened, children played in the narrow streets beneath gentle skies, and yet in the distance there was always the faint hum of engines, the ghostly vibration of a future written in smoke. In this deceptive calm, Hugh Dowding worked with relentless focus, refining the defensive lattice he had spent years building, reassessing squadron rotations, and studying the patterns of German reconnaissance flights with the gaze of a man piecing together a puzzle too vast for most minds to hold. The burden lay not in the daily decisions, but in the ceaseless knowledge that one miscalculation could result in unimaginable loss. His staff observed him moving through Fighter Command headquarters, with the quiet step of a man at war not only with an enemy, but with the weight of responsibility itself. When the Luftwaffe finally unleashed its full force, Britain trembled. Great waves of bombers crossed the Channel under fighter escort, a dark armada bent on breaking the Royal Air Force before turning its fury upon the cities. Churchill watched from command bunkers, his heart divided between resolve and dread, fully aware that the fate of the nation rested on the shoulders of a commander he had scarcely expected to rise beyond ordinary expectations. Yet what unfolded in those opening weeks stunned even the most experienced military observers. Dowding's system, his intricate web of radar stations, filter rooms, sector controls, and disciplined fighter squadrons, responded with an efficiency and accuracy that seemed almost impossible in the chaos of modern air war. Controllers tracked German formations long before they reached the coast, vectored fighters into intercept positions with remarkable precision, and ensured that every British squadron was thrown into action only at the decisive moment, never prematurely, never wastefully. Churchill, observing these operations, realized that Dowding had crafted an entirely new language of warfare, one that blended technology and human judgment into a single living organism. Yet for all his growing admiration, he had not anticipated the price Dowding would pay for his success. Even as the nation began to sense a fragile confidence, voices within the Air Ministry continued to undermine him, criticizing his refusal to engage in sweeping offensive raids, accusing him of excessive caution, and insisting that a more aggressive hand was needed to inspire both pilots and public. Dowding absorbed these blows with weary patience, understanding that political hunger for spectacle often overshadowed the quiet discipline required to survive a grinding, attritional battle. Events in the sky grew more ferocious. British pilots climbed into Hurricanes and Spitfires with little sleep, their faces gaunt, their hands trembling from exhaustion, their youth burning away in the furnace of constant combat. Dowding watched squadron reports come in with a cold ache tightening in his chest, aware that every victory written on the map was paid for in lives that could never be replaced. He argued endlessly for more aircraft, more trained pilots, more resources to keep his thin line of defenders from collapse. Yet political support remained tepid. Production shortages, bureaucratic disputes, and inter-service rivalries slowed the delivery of reinforcements, leaving Dowding to wring every possible ounce of strength from a force stretched past endurance. Churchill, though publicly confident, did not fully grasp the desperation simmering beneath Dowding's composed exterior. He saw the reports of downed enemy aircraft, the survival of British airfields, the resilience of fighter command, but he could not see the intimate agony of a commander forced to send barely trained pilots into battle or merge squadrons depleted to a handful of exhausted survivors. Dowding carried these decisions alone, speaking of them to no one, burying their weight in the quiet hours of early morning, when he paced the dimly lit rooms of headquarters, with the breathless awareness that Britain's future might collapse before dawn. Still, he persevered. He refined rotation schedules to preserve what little strength remained among his pilots, adjusted resource allocations, and pushed for the continued improvement of radar stations battered by bombs and storms alike. He insisted that fighter command remain a defensive shield rather than a reckless sword, a stance that infuriated several influential commanders who desired glory, promotion, or the satisfaction of taking the fight to the enemy. Dowding's resistance earned him enemies, but he never wavered. The defense of Britain, he believed, demanded restraint as much as courage. As the Luftwaffe shifted tactics, targeting airfields with increasing ferocity, Dowding's brilliance shone again in ways Churchill had not foreseen. He recognized patterns in the enemy's assaults that others mistook for randomness, predicting their efforts to break fighter command through attrition. Through careful management, he kept the system alive, even as sector stations burned and radar masts lay twisted in shattered grass. Churchill visited damaged sites and listened to the accounts of pilots and ground crews, slowly realizing that the man directing their survival was accomplishing something nearly superhuman, preserving the fighting core of the RAF under conditions that should have crushed it. The political winds, however, did not soften. Rumours of Dowding's imminent replacement swept through the corridors of power. Yet even as his position grew fragile, he stood at his post with unwavering conviction, determined to hold the line until the last pilot, the last aircraft, the last chance had been given its moment. And in those crucial days, Britain endured not because of sweeping political strategy, but because Dowding had built a machine capable of surviving the storm. The turning point of the air war came not with a triumphant charge, but with a subtle shift, almost imperceptible in the daily thunder of engines and explosions. As August bled into September, the Luftwaffe intensified its attacks, hurling squadron after squadron across the Channel in an effort to grind fighter command into dust. Airfields were targeted relentlessly, hangars reduced to twisted metal, runways cratered and smeared with oil and wreckage. Pilots who returned from missions found their home bases in smouldering ruin, their friends lost, their aircraft patched with hurried repairs that never seemed enough. And through all of this, Hugh Dowding stood watching the conflict unfold, with the calm sorrow of a man who understood that the enemy's fury was not simply aimed at infrastructure, but at the very idea of resistance itself. Churchill, observing reports in the underground rooms of Whitehall, recognized more clearly than ever the magnitude of Dowding's achievement. Britain still fought. The skies still swarmed with hurricanes and Spitfires. The radar stations still blinked their warnings across the map. But even as the Prime Minister marvelled at this unexpected resilience, he could not fully appreciate the precariousness behind it. Dowding's system was holding, yes, but it was stretched so thin that even a single day of catastrophic losses might have snapped it entirely. Pilots were flying 3, sometimes 4 sorties a day, many barely out of training school, their hands trembling on the controls and their faces shadowed by exhaustion. Ground crews worked through the night to keep aircraft airborne, patching holes with whatever scrap metal they could find, sleeping in short shifts beneath the echo of distant bombing. Inside fighter command, Dowding moved like a ghost, his presence steady but almost spectral. He rarely raised his voice, rarely allowed emotion to break through the controlled exterior, but those who knew him saw the toll etched into the tight set of his jaw and the growing heaviness in his eyes. He read casualty lists alone, lingering over the names of young men he had personally approved for service, men whose potential had been extinguished in minutes of fire and steel. He refused to celebrate kill counts or boast of victories, because for him, each number carried a shadow, a balance of lives lost and lives saved, a complex equation that weighed heavily on a conscience already burdened beyond measure. Yet in the midst of this crushing pressure, Dowding made decisions that would change the course of the battle. The Luftwaffe, frustrated by Britain's unbroken defence, shifted its focus from airfields to civilian centres, believing that terror would succeed where tactical destruction had failed. London burned, the night sky lit by infernos that turned streets into rivers of molten brick and glass. The change in German strategy horrified Churchill but opened a narrow, desperate window for Dowding. With the attacks on airfields easing, even slightly, he could rotate squadrons more efficiently, repair critical infrastructure, and give his pilots a few precious hours of rest. It was not mercy, but it was enough. Churchill never expected that Dowding, working without the full backing of the political machine, could seize such an opportunity with the quiet precision of a surgeon. While ministers debated retaliatory bombing, Dowding focused entirely on survival. He redirected resources to battered sector stations, ensuring they could remain operational even under renewed attack. He reorganized squadrons to maintain defensive density around key industrial regions, understanding that Britain's war effort depended as much on factories as on pilots. And as morale fluctuated across the country, Dowding's calm steadiness became an invisible anchor, never publicly praised but deeply felt within the ranks. Churchill visited Fighter Command during these pivotal weeks, trying to understand the architecture of this strange, invisible war. He watched the great plotting table move with constant motion, watched the controllers issue orders with crisp discipline, watched the teleprinters chatter with coded messages from distant stations. It was then that he grasped, perhaps for the first time, the true extent of Dowding's achievement. The system was not merely functional, it was miraculous. It had transformed chaos into choreography, despair into endurance. And though Churchill admired it, he was also struck by how fragile it remained, how dependent it was on the man who had shaped it. Yet even as Churchill's respect for Dowding deepened, the political knives sharpened with each passing week. Rival commanders sensed opportunity in the shifting tides of war. Senior figures within the Air Ministry, frustrated by Dowding's refusal to embrace their preferred tactics, whispered that he was too old, too rigid, too detached from the fiery spirit required in wartime. They argued that Britain needed a commander who would strike boldly across the Channel, someone whose style matched Churchill's own defiant rhetoric. Dowding's quiet, methodical brilliance earned him few allies. Still, he remained unmoved by the political storm gathering behind him. His focus never wavered from the imperative of defending Britain's skies. He refused to allow emotion or ambition to intrude upon strategy. To him, the battle was not about glory, but about survival, about keeping Britain alive long enough for fate to shift in its favour. And so, through the darkest nights of the Blitz, as Londoners huddled in shelters and the glow of burning districts illuminated the horizon, Dowding preserved the thin, wavering line that held the enemy at bay. He achieved what Churchill had never quite dared expect. He kept Britain from falling. As September deepened and the nights grew colder, a weary rhythm settled over Britain, a pulse of defiance that beat beneath the roar of sirens and the distant thunder of falling bombs. The people had learned to live between warnings, to sleep in fragments, to walk through streets dusted with debris, as though the war were an unwanted season that would pass, if only they endured long enough. Yet for Hugh Dowding, there was no rhythm, no pause, no separation between day and night. He existed in a state of perpetual vigilance, a man suspended between exhaustion and duty, sustained only by the knowledge that each moment demanded his full attention. While others saw the shifting tides of the battle in bursts of flame over the capital, or in the bold headlines of morning newspapers, Dowding saw the war as an endless series of fragile calculations, each one balancing aircraft, pilots, weather, fuel, and endurance against the relentless force pressing in from the continent. By now, Churchill had begun to sense, with increasing clarity, the magnitude of what Dowding had achieved. The Battle of Britain had not ended. It raged still, unpredictable and vicious, but the RAF continued to stand, bruised, yet unbroken. Churchill watched the daily reports with a mixture of pride and incredulity. He saw the numbers of enemy aircraft downed, the stubborn survival of fighter command posts, the steady resilience of radar stations rising once more from their craters. What he didn't see, what he could not fully grasp, were the intimate sacrifices hidden behind each success. Dowding read through operational reports that spoke of squadrons returning with only 2 aircraft, of pilots limping home with engines coughing smoke and wings held together by hope and wire, of young men so exhausted they could barely unbuckle their harnesses upon landing. These details rarely reached the Prime Minister's desk, concealed by the necessary brevity of military summaries, but they lived within Dowding like burns pressed too deep to heal. And yet, despite the critical state of fighter command, the pressure to launch offensive operations only grew louder. Voices within the Air Ministry insisted that Britain must demonstrate strength by attacking German airfields and infrastructure in France. They argued that striking the enemy would bolster morale, weaken German air capability, and align with Churchill's fierce rhetoric. But Dowding refused. He knew that the thin defensive line he commanded could not withstand the losses such missions would inevitably bring. He understood that every pilot lost in a distant raid was a pilot absent when the next wave of bombers crossed the channel. His refusal to comply was seen by some as obstinacy, even cowardice, but Dowding held firm to the principle that survival was a strategy in itself. Britain needed time. Time for industry to catch up, for new pilots to finish training, for the enemy to overextend. Churchill, for all his admiration of bold action, began to understand the wisdom in Dowding's restraint. Though he bristled at the idea of appearing passive in the face of German aggression, he recognized the fragility of the moment. Britain could not afford another Dunkirk in the skies. He found himself caught between the clamour of his advisers and the quiet clarity of the man who had built the system holding Britain together. Yet Churchill still underestimated the depth of Dowding's isolation. The Air Ministry grew increasingly hostile, perceiving Dowding's caution as a challenge to their authority. Rival commanders manoeuvred behind closed doors, positioning themselves as successors, whispering that Dowding lacked the vigour demanded by the moment. They spoke of him as a relic of an older war, miscasting his meticulous methodology as an inability to inspire. Unaware or unconcerned by these political currents, Dowding continued his relentless work. He pushed for improvements in pilot rest cycles, recognizing that exhaustion had become as dangerous as enemy bullets. He oversaw the reorganization of squadrons to distribute depleted units across quieter sectors, allowing shattered crews the smallest chance to recover. He fought for every aircraft engine, every spare part, every mechanic who could be diverted to critical airfields. His persistence, quiet but unyielding, held together the frayed edges of fighter command long enough for the tide to begin favouring Britain. As the Luftwaffe faced mounting losses and the autumn weather shifted in Britain's favour, the pattern of attacks grew less consistent. The enemy's confidence faltered. British intelligence intercepted signs of strain, revealing that German pilots were flying longer missions with fewer reinforcements. Dowding saw in these developments the faint outline of victory, but he refused to relax his guard. He instructed controllers to avoid complacency, knowing that a single misjudged scramble could expose a region to devastating attack. In London, Churchill prepared speeches that reflected the emerging truth that Britain had endured not through blinding courage alone, but through systems, discipline, and quiet brilliance. He praised the pilots publicly, rightly calling them the few. And though he rarely named Dowding, he knew that the commander's steady hand had shaped the survival of the nation. But Churchill did not expect, even now, how deeply Dowding's contributions ran, nor how many of them would remain invisible long after the battle was won. For even as the threat began to ease, political pressure reached its highest pitch. Dowding's enemies saw an opportunity to reshape command before the victory could be fully attributed to him. Churchill, occupied with decisions stretching far beyond the skies over Britain, did not intervene. The quiet man who had guarded Britain's survival remained without political protection, left to weather the storms of ambition and resentment alone. Yet in these closing months of the battle, Dowding accomplished something Churchill never anticipated. He forged not only a defence but a doctrine, a blueprint for modern air warfare that would echo across decades. He demonstrated that victory could be achieved not through theatrics or reckless heroism, but through clarity, foresight, and the unshakable determination to preserve life whenever possible. As October settled over Britain with its cool breath and dim mornings, the tempo of war shifted once more, becoming less predictable, less frantic, yet in many ways more psychologically heavy. The Luftwaffe had not vanished. Their raids still cut through the night, and their reconnaissance flights still probed the weakened edges of Britain's defences. But the great waves that had once thundered across the Channel had thinned, faltering under the weight of losses and frustrated ambition. For the first time in many months, there were stretches of hours, sometimes even a full day, when the skies lay unnervingly quiet, as if the enemy were inhaling, preparing for some final blow. To the public, this lull felt like hope. To Hugh Dowding, it felt like a trap. He had learned not to trust silence. He had spent too long reading patterns, feeling the shifts in enemy behaviour like invisible tides, and now the stillness unsettled him more deeply than the fiercest bombardments. In the dimly lit rooms of fighter command, He moved from map to chart to communication station with an almost fragile meticulousness, noting every subtle change in German tactics, every hint of reorganization. He sensed that the enemy was recalibrating, not retreating, and he refused to let Britain drift into false comfort. Churchill, meanwhile, stood before the nation with words that carried defiance and pride. His speeches echoed across the airwaves, reminding the British people of what they had endured and what they had achieved. He praised the pilots, the few, and exalted the resilience of ordinary citizens who had stood firm through nights of fire and ruin. Yet even as he addressed the nation, he remained only partially aware of how perilously thin the RAF's strength had become. He knew Britain had survived the height of the onslaught, but he did not see the frayed edges of Dowding's command, the pilots whose nerves trembled uncontrollably, the aircraft patched so many times they carried scars like wounded men, the ground crews who moved with the exhausted efficiency of souls, too tired to feel fear anymore. Dowding saw it all. He saw the cost in every pair of hollow eyes, every trembling hand that reached for a cup of tea during brief moments of rest. He knew that victory in the Battle of Britain, if such a thing could be claimed, had been achieved not by any single stroke of brilliance, but by a relentless endurance that left even the survivors marked forever. And still, he pushed on. He reviewed squadron readiness with a harsh honesty, refusing to pretend that damaged units were capable when they were not. He fought for more resources from the Air Ministry, demanding replacement aircraft and fresh pilots, even as those demands stirred further resentment among his political opponents. For Dowding's isolation had deepened. Where Churchill's star rose brighter with each passing week, Dowding's influence dimmed beneath the weight of bureaucratic envy. His refusal to yield to pressure had earned him admiration from some and hostility from many. Senior officers whispered that he lacked the aggressive vision needed for the next phase of the war. Others said he had grown tired, that his cautious nature would hold Britain back now that the immediate crisis had passed. They overlooked, perhaps conveniently, that Dowding's caution had preserved fighter command when bolder strategies would have destroyed it entirely. Churchill, though increasingly aware of the political battle brewing around Dowding, did not intervene. He was consumed by the broader war, by demands from the Admiralty, by pressures from the Home Office, by constant appeals from Allied governments now exiled in London. He respected Dowding, but he did not fully comprehend how precarious the commander's position had become. Nor did he anticipate how ruthlessly some in the Air Ministry would move to sideline the man who had shielded Britain through its darkest skies. Still, even as the political ground shifted beneath him, Dowding remained wholly focused on the work that had defined him. He oversaw the reinforcement of radar stations battered by months of assault, ensuring that the chain of detection remained unbroken. He pushed for improved aircraft radio systems, understanding that communication failures cost lives as surely as enemy bullets. He reorganized training programs to reduce the gap between classroom instruction and combat readiness, determined that no young pilot should again enter battle without the skills to survive their first encounter. Churchill had never expected Dowding to achieve such things without political support, and he certainly had not anticipated that the quiet commander would continue improving Britain's defences even as rivals circled like vultures. For Dowding did not work for recognition. He worked because Britain was not yet safe. The enemy still occupied the continent. The threat of invasion lingered like a cold shadow over the coast. And winter, with its unpredictable storms and long nights, loomed ahead, promising both danger and opportunity. In these weeks of uneasy transition, Dowding shaped the RAF for the war still to come. He guided the integration of new aircraft models, supervised the rebuilding of bomb-damaged stations, and refined fighter tactics based on hard-won experience. He did all of this quietly, without fanfare, without the political armour that might have protected his position. He simply worked, as he always had, with a quiet strength that few recognised and even fewer acknowledged. And in that quiet, Britain found its next breath. By early November, when the air turned sharp and the evenings arrived sooner than anyone wanted, Britain existed in a strange transition between exhaustion and awakening. The worst of the Battle of Britain had passed, though no one dared say so aloud. The Luftwaffe still prowled the skies, but their confidence had fractured, their strategy clouded by uncertainty, their losses too deep to conceal. It was in these quiet, icy days that Hugh Dowding walked the corridors of Fighter Command with a heaviness that even victory could not ease. For he knew, with painful clarity, that his work in securing Britain's survival had drawn to its end, not because the war was over, but because the politics he had long ignored had finally risen to claim him. Dowding had never sought power, had never mastered the social rituals of military politics, had never learned the subtle art of flattery or the strategic exchange of favours. Instead, he had dedicated himself entirely to the craft of defence, to the near impossible act of holding back an enemy that seemed destined to overwhelm Britain by sheer weight of numbers. Yet now, as Britain stood battered but unbroken, the voices that had been whispering against him throughout the summer grew louder, more confident. They spoke of the need for fresh leadership, for younger commanders, for a new direction in the air war. They ignored the truth that Dowding himself had made such conversations possible. Churchill, worn thin by the unbroken demands of global war, did not intervene. Perhaps he believed Dowding had earned his rest. Perhaps he trusted the Air Ministry too deeply. Or perhaps he did not fully understand the injustice unfolding before him. The quiet removal of the man who had crafted the very shield that allowed Churchill to proclaim Britain's defiance to the world. For all the Prime Minister's gift with words, he never truly grasped the solitude in which Dowding had worked, nor the depth of opposition he had endured behind closed doors. Churchill respected Dowding, but he had never expected the quiet commander to achieve what he had achieved without the support of powerful allies, and so he did not realise how vulnerable Dowding had been all along. When the order finally came, calm, bureaucratic, almost clinical in its phrasing, Dowding accepted it with the same solemn composure he had brought to every decision during the battle. There were no speeches, no ceremonies, no outpouring of gratitude from the institutions he had protected. He simply gathered his few belongings, nodded to the officers who had served beside him, and walked away from the command he had shaped with every ounce of strength he possessed. Those who watched him leave felt a silence settle over the room. Not the silence of dismissal, but the silence of witnessing something irreplaceable passing into history. Yet the weight of Dowding's legacy could not be erased by administrative reshuffling or political ambition. The system he built remained intact, a living structure that continued to protect Britain through the long years of war that followed. The young pilots he had fought to preserve would go on to defend the skies of Europe. The radar network he championed would become the backbone of Allied air power. The doctrines he refined would shape air strategy for generations. Dowding's fingerprints were everywhere, though few would speak his name beyond quiet circles of those who knew the truth. Churchill eventually understood. In the years after the war, as the nation sifted through memory and myth to shape a narrative of its survival, Churchill came to recognise the profound debt owed to the quiet man he had once underestimated. He spoke with admiration of Dowding's foresight, his discipline, his refusal to bend to pressure, though the words came too late to alter the injustices done to him. But Dowding had never sought applause. He wanted only that Britain should live, and it had. And so, the story ends, not with triumph or bitterness, but with a quiet recognition that sometimes the greatest victories are shaped by those who work unseen, who carry the weight of a nation without ceremony or acclaim, whose resolve becomes the silent architecture of survival. Dowding never expected gratitude, and Churchill never expected Dowding to achieve what he did without political support. Yet history remembers, even if the men of their time did not. If this story moved you, don't forget to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journey through the hidden corners of history.